War in the Middle Ages was brutal, and when battles ended, the chaos didn't simply disappear. Victory or defeat decided the future of kingdoms, but what remained on the field was something no one could ignore. Thousands of bodies lying where they had fallen. Some were honored and carried home, while others were stripped, dumped into pits, or left to decay. What happened to the dead after medieval battles tells us not only about warfare, but also about religion, society, and the harsh realities of life in that era. Number 1. After the fighting stopped. When a medieval battle ended, the silence that followed was overwhelming. The noise of swords and shouting was replaced by groans of the wounded and the cries of horses still alive but badly injured. The ground was littered with bodies, knights in armor, infantrymen with spears, and animals that had carried them into combat. Chroniclers often described the smell of blood and rot spreading across the field within hours, especially if the battle happened in summer. Flies swarmed, and crows and dogs quickly appeared to feed on the corpses. For soldiers who survived, the last thing they thought about was cleaning the battlefield. Many were wounded, exhausted, or simply eager to leave before another army appeared. Most medieval armies had no organized system for body disposal. There were no dedicated units like in modern wars. Commanders were focused on securing prisoners, looting valuables, or moving to the next strategic location. The task of dealing with the dead often fell to locals living near the battlefield, and for them, it was both dangerous and traumatic. Peasants feared disease because people believed rotting corpses spread plague through the air. While this belief wasn't fully accurate, rotting bodies did contaminate water supplies and made living conditions unbearable. Villagers were sometimes ordered by lords to dig huge pits, but when thousands of men had died, graves were shallow, and decomposition caused bodies to rise back to the surface after heavy rain. Social status played a huge role in what happened next. Wealthy knights or nobles were usually collected by their retainers, or ransomed back to families for proper burial in consecrated ground. For the ordinary soldier, there was little chance of such care. Their corpses were thrown into mass graves without prayers or markers. Sometimes they were left unburied entirely, becoming food for scavengers. Looting added another layer of grim reality survivors, and camp followers stripped the dead of armor, weapons, boots, and even clothing, leaving many bodies naked and difficult to identify. So, after the fighting stopped, the battlefield turned into a place of horror. It was not only a physical reminder of death, but also a logistical and spiritual problem. The sheer number of dead made it impossible to honor everyone, and the fate of each body depended on wealth, victory, and chance. Number 2. The winners made the rules. When a medieval battle ended, the power to decide what happened to the dead rested in the hands of the victors. The side that controlled the field had the time and authority to manage the corpses, and their decisions shaped the final image of the battlefield. For men of status lords, knights, or nobles from wealthy families, the treatment was usually careful and respectful. Their bodies were valuable not just for sentimental reasons, but also for political and financial ones. Families often paid to have their relatives returned, and ransom was as common for corpses as it was for prisoners. A noble's armor might be taken as a prize, but the body itself was often preserved and transported so that it could be buried in the family's chosen church or monastery. Such burials were symbols of honor and lineage, ensuring that the memory of the fallen remained intact. For ordinary soldiers, the reality was far different. Most were seen as expendable and were treated with little regard. After battles that left thousands dead, digging individual graves was impossible. Instead, mass pits were opened where bodies were dumped together. These graves were often shallow, hastily dug, and not designed to last. In wet weather, soil shifted and corpses reappeared on the surface, creating grim sights for months or even years after the fighting. Sometimes the victors ignored the bodies entirely, leaving them where they had fallen. Animals and weather completed the process, scattering bones across the land. The choices made by the victors were shaped by practical needs. They had to think about the risk of disease, the demands of moving on to the next campaign, and the limited manpower available for such exhausting labor. Respect for the enemy was rarely a factor unless the fallen had status or political importance. In most cases, burial was about speed, not dignity. This approach shows how power decided fate even after death. A noble might rest in a stone tomb under a church roof, while countless common soldiers ended up in forgotten pits, erased from memory except for the bones that farmers uncovered generations later. Number 3. Religion shaped decisions. In the Middle Ages, religion was central to everyday life, and death on the battlefield was no exception. People believed strongly that being buried in consecrated ground mattered for the soul's salvation. A proper Christian burial was not only about respect, but also about the hope of eternal peace. Priests often traveled with armies, offering blessings before combat, and sometimes giving last rites to the dying. After battles, these priests tried to provide prayers for the dead, but the scale of death made this nearly impossible. When thousands of men lay dead, no group of clergy could handle the task, so choices had to be made. Nobles, commanders, and anyone who could pay, or who held status, usually received priority. Their bodies might be moved to a church or monastery nearby, where they could be laid to rest with ceremony. Ordinary soldiers had almost no chance of such treatment. Their corpses were often placed in large pits without prayers, or in some cases, left to decay where they fell. Religion also shaped how enemies were treated. During the Crusades, the divide between Christians and Muslims was sharp. Fallen soldiers of the opposing faith were rarely given dignity. Christian armies often left Muslim bodies to rot in the open, dumped them into rivers, or burned them without ceremony. Muslim forces sometimes responded in the same way, viewing Christian soldiers as unbelievers unworthy of ritual burial. Even within Europe, bodies of those considered heretics or traitors were denied burial in holy ground. This exclusion was a powerful statement, marking them as dishonored even after death. The idea of the battlefield as sacred or cursed ground also came from religious belief. Chroniclers described mass graves being blessed by priests to protect the living from restless spirits. Villagers near battlefields sometimes erected small crosses or shrines where soldiers had fallen, turning the sites into places of prayer. But these gestures were limited. For most of the dead, faith did not guarantee a respectful resting place. Instead, religion created divisions, giving honor to a few and leaving many others forgotten in unmarked graves. The spiritual importance of burial was clear, but in practice, it depended on wealth, rank, and which side you fought for. Number 4. Stripped and looted. When a battle was over, the field did not stay quiet for long. Survivors, camp followers, and sometimes even local villagers rushed to the dead to take anything of value. Looting was not seen as shameful, but as a natural part of warfare. A knight's armor could cost as much as a farm, so leaving it behind on a corpse was unthinkable. Soldiers pulled off helmets, breastplates, chainmail, and boots, and they took swords, daggers, and shields. Even belts, gloves, or simple purses were taken, since leather and metal had real worth. What this meant in practice was that many bodies were stripped until they were almost naked, lying twisted in the mud. For families who came later to search for relatives, this stripping created heartbreak. Without armor or coats of arms, bodies were harder to recognize. Widows or brothers sometimes had to look at the faces of swollen and mutilated corpses to find scars, teeth, or small personal items that might prove identity. Chroniclers wrote of women fainting on battlefields after recognizing a loved one only by a ring or a piece of hair. Stripping also delayed burials. Looters often worked first, digging through the dead for valuables, and only afterward did anyone think about mass graves. The practice did not stop with soldiers. Ordinary villagers, living in poverty, sometimes joined the scavenging once the armies left. They pulled weapons from hands, cut straps of armor, and even removed clothes from the fallen, because cloth was expensive to make. For some, it was survival, not cruelty. But the effect was the same. Bodies were dishonored and left unprotected, which quickened decay and left them open to animals. Looting made the battlefield both an economic opportunity and a place of horror. Valuable equipment went back into circulation, while the human remains were reduced to unrecognizable husks. It showed the harsh logic of medieval war, where material gain mattered more than the dignity of the dead, and where the line between survival and disrespect was often impossible to separate. Number 5. The problem of disease. One of the biggest concerns after a medieval battle was the health risk caused by so many unburied corpses. People at the time believed in the idea of miasma, which meant that foul air from rotting bodies carried sickness. This was not completely correct, but the danger was still real. Decaying flesh attracted insects and animals, and if bodies were left near streams or rivers, the water could become contaminated. Villages that relied on these water sources sometimes suffered outbreaks of disease or stomach illnesses soon after a battle. The smell of the battlefield was often described as unbearable, and many believed simply breathing it could cause plague. Because of these fears, armies sometimes made the unusual decision to burn corpses. Cremation was against Christian teaching, but when commanders feared pestilence, they turned to fire as the fastest way to clean the land. Burning hundreds of bodies was a grim sight, but it was sometimes the only practical solution. In other cases, the responsibility fell on local peasants. Lords or victors forced them to dig trenches and bury the dead in large pits. The work was dangerous and exhausting, and many villagers hated being exposed to so much decay. They would often place the bodies in layers and scatter quicklime on top to reduce the smell and speed decomposition. The problem was that these trenches were rarely deep. Digging large proper graves for thousands of men required more time and manpower than anyone wanted to give. Heavy rains could wash away the soil, exposing bones and corpses again. Travelers passing through former battlefields sometimes described seeing dogs dragging skulls or limbs along the roads, even weeks after the fighting. This gruesome aftermath was not only disturbing, but also kept alive the fear that battlefields were cursed or unhealthy places. The struggle to manage disease showed how limited medieval people were when facing mass death. Without advanced medical knowledge or organized burial units, they could never fully control the health risks that followed every great battle. Number 6. Famous deaths were different. When kings, princes, or celebrated knights were killed in battle, their treatment after death was unlike that of ordinary soldiers. A noble's body held political and symbolic value, so special measures were often taken to preserve it. One common practice was embalming, where the body was treated with spices and wrapped to slow decay. Another, more unusual method was called mos teutonicus. In this process, the corpse was boiled until the flesh separated from the bones. The cleaned bones could then be transported long distances without rotting, allowing the noble to be buried in his homeland or family tomb. This method was especially useful during crusades or campaigns far from Europe, where returning a decaying body would have been impossible. Sometimes parts of the body were buried separately for symbolic or religious reasons. A king's heart or entrails might be placed in a cathedral, while the bones rested in a dynastic crypt. These divided burials gave families the chance to spread influence and honor across multiple sacred sites. For example, a noble might leave his heart in a church he had patronized, while ensuring his bones returned to his ancestral lands. But high status did not always guarantee respect. If a ruler was hated, or if he fell in disgrace, his corpse could be abused. Enemies sometimes decapitated leaders and displayed their heads on spikes, turning death into a warning for others. Bodies could be dragged through streets, hung on gallows, or nailed to city gates as trophies. These acts were meant to humiliate the dead and strip them of their legacy. Even a noble's armor, once a sign of honor, was sometimes displayed as a victory symbol. The contrast between honor and humiliation reveals how deeply politics shaped the fate of famous men. A respected leader might rest in a marble tomb under a cathedral, while a disgraced one could be left to rot in the open as an example. Status, reputation, and enmity determined how the dead were remembered, proving that in medieval warfare, death did not erase social divisions. It reinforced them. Number 7. The land remembered. Long after a medieval battle was fought, the ground itself carried the scars of what happened there. Farmers who returned to their fields sometimes struck skulls, bones, or fragments of armor when they plowed. Chroniclers wrote about peasants who feared working land where so many had died, believing that such soil was cursed, or that spirits wandered restlessly. In some regions, shallow graves shifted with rain, and bones appeared on the surface years later, reminding everyone of the violence that had once covered the earth. Travelers passing through described fields where bleached skeletons still lay visible, mixed with rusted swords or broken shields, silent testimony to the brutality of war. These battlefields often became places of superstition. People thought the souls of the unburied dead could not rest, and stories of ghosts roaming the fields spread quickly. Some villages placed small crosses or built shrines near mass graves, hoping to bring peace to the area. Pilgrims sometimes visited to pray for the souls of the fallen, treating the land as holy ground, while others avoided such places entirely, fearing they were haunted. This gave many battle sites a lasting reputation, shaping local memory for generations. Over time, the land itself absorbed the dead. Rain, wind, and farming scattered bones across fields, rivers, and woods. Yet not all traces disappeared. Archaeologists today still uncover pits filled with medieval soldiers, their remains jumbled together with weapons and armor fragments. These discoveries confirm how often men were buried hastily, without ceremony, and left to become part of the landscape. Most who died in these wars were never honored by name or remembered by history. Instead, they became part of the soil, forgotten until unearthed centuries later. The land remembered in its own way. Beneath farms, villages, and even modern cities, countless soldiers still lie in hidden graves, silent witnesses to the harsh truth of medieval warfare. Their presence reminds us that the consequences of battle did not end when the fighting stopped, but lingered in the earth for centuries.